Well, here's the star of this show. It's a Radio Shack MD-992 keyboard. Probably goes back into the 80s or 90s. The wife's always had an ambition to want to play the piano. So with any hobby, I wasn't going to start out wide open throttle buying $1,000 keyboard. This one turned up at Goodwill, and a friend bought it for about 40 bucks. No power supply, and at best the on-off switch was a bit finicky. So I took all the screws out, opened it up, I cleaned up the switch contacts, and then lubricated it all with the good contact grease. Put it all back together, and it's been working fine ever since. By the way, if you don't have a tube of this, it's something you want to keep in your toolbox if you do any work with electrical, or if you deal with lighting, especially if you've got a boat trailer. I've had lights go an entire season in salt water with no trouble with this stuff. Works great, but I digress. So, back to the keyboard. It worked fine for a couple months. Didn't have any trouble with it. I had to give her one of my power supplies, and then she wanted a light to help read music. So I readapted one of my light projects I'd worked on a while back, converting a 110 volt reading light to a 12 volt DC light using automotive style LEDs. This works great moving light around, because since they're LEDs, the lamp doesn't get hot and there's no way she's going to burn herself trying to adjust the light to read music. The keyboard draws about 800 milliamps tops, so she needs a fairly robust power supply. I had this one left over from some projects a while back. As you can see, it's adjustable. Uses the Radio Shack's adapter plug format, but I found I needed it back for some other projects, so that was one reason for the upgrade. The keyboard power supply needed to be 9 volts with a center negative connection. My little light was DC 12 volts with a center positive connection, so I had two separate voltages to deal with. That of course meant I had two separate power supplies, one 12 volt power supply for the light and the 9 volt power supply for the keyboard. So here's my new power supply. This one is 12 volt positive, about 2.5 amps maximum. It has a standard DC jack with 12 volt center positive on it, which meant of course the keyboard was wired reverse for what the power supply was. So I had to make a few modifications to the keyboard to change both the voltage and the power supply connection. Okay, so let's get started. Here's the bottom of the keyboard, and there are over 24 screws to take out, so this took a while. I won't bore you with that. Here's a shot of the existing power supply connection on the back of the keyboard. And here's a shot of the same connection with the cover removed, exposing all the jacks. Okay, my plan was to go ahead and take out the existing power connection and then solder in a new voltage regulator in its place, and then wire in two new keyboard power supply taps consisting of chassis connectors 5.5 by 2.1 to accommodate the new power supply and the power for the LED lamp. In this shot I removed the power connection, added a couple more holes for the wiring to be used for the power jacks, and then slightly enlarged the holes so I can insert the voltage regulator in them. Here's the heatsink I'll be using. It's a salvage item, as is the LM7809 you see here. I bent the pins to accommodate the existing connections to the PC board. And here's a new voltage regulator soldered in, along with a couple surface mount capacitors. I won't catch any neatness points for the capacitors, but these things are extremely hard to work with without the proper tools, especially on a retrofit application, but they did go in. They're working quite nicely. I decided to go ahead and use surface mount to avoid drilling a whole bunch of extra holes in a printed circuit board. It was already pretty crowded on the other side, so this was just more or less a convenience and not a convenience, since it's very difficult to solder these little small components in place, especially on an existing board. Here's a shot of the back of the voltage regulator with the heatsink in place. All the soldering is complete on the top of the board. It was difficult to get the printed circuit board out of the unit because the ribbon connectors are connected to it, and it was soldered in place with the ribbon connectors. So I had to insert everything from the bottom and couldn't flip it over. Here's the new bulkhead DC jack soldered in. One input for the power supply, one output for the light. They're basically just wired in parallel. And the final little wiring project, a little short DC connection. All I'm going to do is put another plug on the other side of it, and then I've got a 5.5 by 2.1 on both ends. This is the little jumper for the light that plugs into the back of the keyboard. And here's the whole thing finished and put back together. Now she's got one high-class power supply. It's probably better than the one she was using. Certainly more current capable. Then I've eliminated the power supply for the light, so I've only got one cord running to the wall, which of course gives me one more place to plug in something in like a lamp. And now the $64,000 question, after all that work, does it work? There's the light. Well, that cleaned up the wiring a good deal. Gave me one less cord to trip over. Give her a more reliable power supply. And makes the keyboard that much nicer to work with. If you like what you're seeing, give me a like and check back often. Might even want to consider subscribing because I got a lot more little toys on the way. Y'all have fun now here.